There you go. Okay. And we'll get started. Let's start by just any, if you have any questions about the assignment. Basically, there's no particular right or wrong answer. That's the thing. The idea there is to get just a feel from what I've given you in terms of talking about the difference between comparative advantage and increasing returns to scale, and just to look at the data at the two-digit level, and then just to develop some ideas of what might be going on. And then the idea there is at some later date, if you wanted to, you could test that. And that's the idea is here, develop a hypothesis, look at data, develop a hypothesis, and then you can test it. And that's a lot of what we do in economics. We do a lot of that. Economic analysis involves that, looking at developing hypothesis and hypothesis about how the world works, and then going to the data and testing that to see whether or not that's true. I just wanted to go very briefly over this. Hopefully you've had a chance to read, read over that, the paper that, because Dr. Krugman provides some explanation for this model that should help, hopefully to help further explain what it was talking about in the model. One of the things I just wanted to make a point, he talks about this, here is the endowment. Let's say if it's somewhere outside of these parallelograms, say at some point like there at EO, some endowment that's outside of this area, it's impossible. If that happens, that trade, there's no gain from trade, because there's just so, this country too has so little capital and so much, has a lot of labor, and very little capital, and so because of that, even if they try to specialize in all they can only produce. Get to this point on the production possibility curve. That's all they can get to. So country A or country 1 would have to. It's impossible for it to specialize in this case. So what you have here, you have to have some kind of endowment that's of labor and capital that's inside of that, so that you can get the mix. Given the production possibilities, that you get some mix where you can have trade. So that he makes that point. He makes that point in the paper, and I just wanted to point that out. I also wanted to just point out it's not easy, and you had the question. The question is, what's the difference between a comparative advantage and increasing returns to scale. Increasing returns to scale means a reduction in cost as an industry gets larger. And in particular, when we're talking about increasing returns to scale, we're talking about very localized, and let me emphasize that, we're talking about localized increasing returns to scale. Localized means in one place. One place or very relatively small area, so that the firms that are interacting can interact within a local, with the labor market in the local area, and that because of that interaction, the nature of that interaction, it produces reductions in cost as the industry gets larger in a place. So that's what we're talking about here. That's the one thing. Where in comparative advantage, we're typically talking about just in a country At a country level, we're typically not, well, you may have increasing returns to scale, but they're at a country level rather than at a localized level. One of the things also at the 2-digit HS code level, you have a number of goods mixed together. And so it can be difficult to tell. I'm probably going to give you another exercise that you will go in and focus. At the 4-digit level, you can start seeing, you start getting more separation, especially at sometimes at the 6-digit level, but certainly at the 6-digit level, you're much more likely to get it. But even at the 4-digit level, you'll start getting the separation. The 2-digit level, you really have a lot of different things that are going on. So if a country dominates global production at the 2-digit level, it's likely that at least some of the goods mixed together at the 2-digit level are produced under increasing returns to scale, and quite possibly localized in increasing returns to scale. So so this certainly that's one clue. You want to look for something like that. Now, if 2 or more countries or regions dominate production at the 2-digit level, and there's a lot of trade between those countries at the 2-digit level, it's likely that some of this trade results from increasing returns to scale. So it's quite possible that within that, at the 4-digit, 6-digit level, you'll find increasing returns to scale. And what Dr. Krugman, he observed this kind of trade at the 2-digit level, and that's what he started wondering was, well, he was observing that and saying, well, why are they trading the same goods back and forth? And when you go down, it's because they're really not. They're specializing, and the specialization, what he found was quite often, it was with these localized economies. As I say, in comparative advantage, the relative advantage results from a relative cost advantage for a good relative to another good. So when both countries produce as much of the good as possible, and one of the things that you may get is one country exporting raw materials and another country doing manufacturing. That's also a comparative. That's a comparative advantage thing. A country that has raw materials, quite often third world countries, may have raw materials and they trade with first world countries. Another thing, or you have countries countries that are first world countries, but are primarily deal with a lot of their exports are raw materials. Canada and Australia are very good examples of that. Now, under increasing returns to scale, an absolute advantage exists in an industry simply due to the size of the industry at a single location. So that's so under increasing returns to scale in a 2-country, 2-world good world, it would still you could have a comparative advantage and yet have increasing returns to scale. So that is also. That's possible, and that's kind of part of why there can be a bit of confusion. That it may seem confusing, but ultimately the thing is the increasing returns to scale are at a local level. So we'll go more into that later. But for today, we're going to talk about our international trade agreements. We're talking about trade. And an important part of understanding international trade is understanding, well, how do countries make arrangements to trade? Because that's an important point is that countries can keep trade from happening. They can keep goods inside of their country. They can keep goods from being imported into their country. They may control exports. They control imports. This is frequently done through tariffs. The governments tax when goods are imported in a country, governments can tax imports, and so if you have that situation, governments typically like to get revenue, and so they may put high taxes, but those taxes can discourage trade. So what we're going to talk about here are the trade agreements that have existed for the past 150 years that have facilitated global trade. And we've gone through several major eras in trade in the past 150 years. And we'll go through these and see the kind of pattern, and these in turn have affected the pattern of trades, but also it's the kind of technology that's existed in a particular area has also had an impact. We're talking about the pre-World World War I era, about 1860 to 1913. Now this was an era of very rapid economic growth. This was a kind of economic growth that the world had never seen before, basically. The world had never seen the kind of economic growth that was taking place during this era. It was an era of rapid industrial expansion. It was rapid advancements in communication technologies and also rapid advancements in transportation technologies. So the mixture of those two enabled firms to get much larger, and as economies expanded, firms got much larger, and there was more production and the ability to trade. So when that happened, countries were seeing this growth. They were producing goods, but they wanted to trade it, and so the world trade was fostered by a network of bilateral trade agreements. Now, by bilateral, the word bilateral means two. That means trade between. Bilateral, it's one trade between two countries, country A and a B. Some country A and some country B. One of the interesting things we'll see is that the world has gone back to that kind of bilateral trade agreements are now more dominating, we'll get to that a little bit later in the lecture today. These treaties typically featured most favored nation status, that the nations would give each other what most favored nation, the term most favored nation refers to that a country that give each other most favored nation, MFN, the agreement that they make, they agree that if either country that's a party to the agreement makes any other agreement with a third country, that the trade conditions that they give to that third country cannot be better than the conditions they're giving to each other. That's what most favored nation status is. If we say country A and country B send most favored nation status, if there's some country C, even if B makes another agreement with country C, it cannot provide better terms than B is giving to country A. It has to be as good. That's what most favored nation. So it's a promise. It's basically a promise to make, to say, this is as good a deal as we're giving to anybody. As good a deal as we're going to give to anybody. Now, a very important feature of this is the bilateral trade agreements in the late 19th century were typically made without multilateral cooperation. And so what would happen, you did not have multilateral bodies at that time. You had a country A, country B, A and C would make, B and C would make A and C. And so, and as this network of trade agreements grew, basically what happened was that the countries eventually made a kind of web of agreements that when you get enough countries, it starts acting like as if there's a big multilateral trade agreement. So bilateral trade agreements can produce something that looks like a multilateral. And so the result of this, there were quite dramatic reductions in trade barriers. Now it's also an important point to make is that, and I believe we talked about this last semester, there were fixed exchange rates during this period. These countries were on the gold standard during that time in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So currencies were, the value of currencies were fixed. The value of currencies was therefore predictable. And so you had, and that also was due to kind of bilateral agreements between countries that resulted in a web of fixed exchange rates, and the same thing of these bilateral trade agreements. So these were connected. So as they say, low trade barriers, tariffs were generally low, there was relatively little trade discrimination, and world trade flourished during the period as export volume grew faster than output, than GDP. So the percentage of global trade as a percentage of global GDP increased during this period. And an important point to make there is that by 1913, in 1913, I think I mentioned this, might have mentioned this last week, the percentage of global GDP that were in traded products was greater than after that, after World War I started until about 1970. So for more than almost 60-year period after that, this was a very world trade flourished during this 50-year period. World War I was shattered. This network of treaties. The war, which was primarily in Europe, engulfed Europe, but eventually brought in other countries as well, including the United States, but it was primarily a European war. But a lot of the trade Europe was the center, was at that time the center of the global economy. Britain was the world's most powerful economy at the time. The United States was emerging as an important country, but it was still it was a long ways off. Of course, World War I was also caused the breakup of great empires in Europe, and also the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the collapse of the Russian. Of the Russian government and the emergence of the Bolshevik government, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire that took place in the Middle East. That war resulted in tremendous changes, and in fact changes that geopolitically still exist today, and particularly if you're in the Middle East. If you're interested in the Middle East, it's very important to study World War I, because the effect of World War I is still very much in place today in the Middle East. But as a part of the war, resulted in an increase in tariffs, import quotas, and trade discrimination. So countries, while they were fighting, put up trade barriers with each other. Foreign exchange controls were imposed. That's foreign exchange controls. Trade barriers were put in place, but they weren't reduced. And the trade barriers became entrenched. There was a very toxic post-war political environment. When the war was over, the war didn't really end, basically. World War I, it ended in 1918, but in a way it didn't really end. And in fact, 20 years later, Europe was at war again, and there would be the toxic environment that existed at that time included that countries were not going to reduce the trade barriers that were put up. And so as a result, export volumes expanded at about the same rate as the global economy. There was no real, the world economy grew again after the war, but trade only grew at the same rate. Then there was the worldwide depression that started in 1929, which we'll go into much more detail later. And it resulted in a relative reduction in trade. So we had trade shrunk during the war, then it didn't expand in 1921 to 1929, and then in the Great Depression it shrunk some more, so as a share of global GDP. The relative reduction in trade after 1929 is thought to have made the Depression worse. It's possible. Now, an interesting thing is that we have seen a shrinkage of global trade from the Great Recession of the last 10 years, so that may or may not be the case. And certainly there was not an increase in protectionism, at least until recently. But trade grew slower than global output between 1929 and 1939. Annual average global economic growth was only 1.8% between 1913 and 1929. That's very low. Global GDP growth, 1.8%. Real GDP growth is very low. We are now typically, when you're at the world as a whole, about 3%, and probably if you get and I would think that in future years we may see more than 3% of global growth. 1.8% is extremely low historically for the past 150 years. Policymakers, and especially in the UK and the US, believe the decentralized network of trade agreements that existed in the 1860 to 1913 period could not be revived. So this was the picture in the interwar period that existed. Then, of course, we had World War II, and World War II, of course, was another disruption of trade. So basically, you have in the period 1913, 1945, a more than 30-year period, the warfare, trade warfare, trade barriers, a lot of conflict. It's been a very difficult time in world history, probably one of the most disruptive periods that we've had in the past 2 centuries. In that period of 1913, 1914, 1945. So, but at the end of the war, the world finally was at peace again, and as part of that, there was an effort to establish an international trade organization in the early post-war period. This failed due to opposition in the United States Senate. If you know anything about the United States government, if you study any of that, you'll learn that the U.S. Senate typically has to make treaties, or the U.S. Senate gives approval to treaties under the U.S. Constitution, and quite often it's very difficult to get treaties that have been negotiated by the executive branch to be approved by the legislative branch. In 1947, with the failure of the International Trade Organization, there was what was called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. So there wasn't a trade organization, but countries got together and made a general agreement anyway. So they established something that looked a bit like a trade organization, but it wasn't necessarily a formal agreement. It was a general agreement. Countries were getting together and they started coalescing, making agreements within the group. So this is, in fact, not this kind of bilateral type of situation. This is what's called a multilateral. So multilateral trade agreement, and the pattern in a multilateral trade agreement, you may have the countries, and they're all making some kind of agreement within the group rather than between the parties of the group. So this is what a multilateral. So the important point here is that the International Trade Organization was intended to be a type of multilateral organization. Policymakers at the time felt that bilateral agreements were not going to work given the environment that had existed for the previous 30 years. So you had this general agreement. 23 countries were the initial agreement, which did not at the time include Japan and Germany. They were still in the early post-war. The defeated countries were recovering from the war, but they were included. They joined that during the early 1950s. GATT focused on liberalizing trade through a reduction of tariffs and discriminatory trade treatment. Now, basically, it was an effort to undo the damage that took place in the 1914 to 1945 period. Countries participating agreed to implement tariff reductions on an MFN basis. So they were basically giving everybody that were parties to the agreement a form of most favored nation trade status. So, with the U.S., and the important thing to remember here is, again, because of the war and after World War II, the United States emerged as the world power. The Soviet Union was of course an important world power as well, but the U.S. was clearly the leading world power. It's also important to remember that the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc wasn't included in this. The Soviet bloc, the Comintern bloc of countries of the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, were outside of this agreement. Basically, you had these initial reductions in tariffs and discriminatory trade agreement. The number of signatories expanded in the late 1950s, but there was not much further progress. You were getting reductions in trade barriers, more countries growing. It was having a positive impact. It's slowly spreading. But not major beyond the initial agreements in the 1947 agreement. The next major change that took place was the establishment of the European Economic Community in 1958, and that was initially what was called the Benelux countries. The initial 3 countries that involved were Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg were the initial countries that joined, and then France and Germany, France and West Germany, not Germany, but West Germany. I mentioned Germany, actually I should write, should be West Germany. Actually, it wasn't, not East, that did not include East Germany. That's West Germany. So France, Germany, and Italy so these were the 6 initial countries: West Germany and Italy were the 6 countries that were the initial members of the European Economic Community. And these were heavily industrial. These countries by then were heavily industrialized. and a lot of this involved with the trade in manufactured products. So now we just want to take a big picture of, in the GATT era. The GATT era was basically an era of multilateral system. So you had a multilateral system even though you didn't have, at the time, a World Trade Organization. The GATT was not a trade. This is very interesting. It was an era that had a multilateral system without a multilateral organization in trade. And the irony will be that by the time that the World Trade Organization was formally established in the 1990s, countries were then beginning to move away from multilateral. And multilateral agreements were becoming increasingly difficult, and countries then were beginning to make bilateral trade agreements again. So the curious thing is that now that we've had a World Trade Organization, but it's kind of become meaningless in the last 20 years. And in fact, the world is moving towards bilateral, is being dominated more by bilateral trade agreements. It's a very interesting development, which we'll discuss a little bit more. So even what's interesting is that, of course, the European Economic Community later became the European Union. So that was, that were the original 6 countries. This became the European Union. For example, the UK joined in the 1960s, I think 66. The UK joined, and by the 1970s, it had become a powerful bloc. But what became the European Union was seen as underneath the GATT. So the GATT was considered to be, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trades was over organizations such as the European Union, the EEC. Now the thing is that, and the thing that was driving this, the fear during this era, even when you had a European Union, the European Union, the countries were afraid of the world breaking up into trade blocs, because they'd seen what had happened in the 1914-1945 period, the wars, the lack of trade, the trade barriers. The people were afraid of going back to that, of course. There'd been tremendous damage. It was of tremendous damage to the world economy and to the human population. It was tremendous cost of that era. So, not surprisingly, during this era, these were people that had experienced that, especially early, the 40s, 50s, 60s, that still had the direct memory of that period. And so their fear was that a system of exclusionary trading blocs might reemerge. It's also important to remember you had the Cold War. You had the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the United States were engaged in what was called a Cold War, tensions without actual conflict, and where conflicts were fought with proxy wars. Vietnam as an example, but there were a number of other countries. The Middle East was another example. So there was that kind of tension as well, that the world wanted, that the Western Bloc, which included Japan, wanted to stay united in terms of its opposition to the Soviet Union and its bloc. But now, as you got towards the end of this era, of course, China, the emergence of China in the 1980s, as China emerged, and particularly in the early 1990s, this era really came to an end as the dependence of China on access to Western markets became, and that China wanted to be a part of GATT. And it also certainly provided an impetus to some type of global trade agreement. And but the important point there, let's see. So because there was the interesting thing is that there was less conflict as the world moved away from World War II, generations began coming that had no memory of that. Certainly my generation, I was born after the war. I personally was born more than 10 years after the end of the war, and so that was another era for my generation. So you began seeing an increased interest in regional free trade agreements. The FTA means free trade agreements in the 1980s. And of course, the great event of the late 1980s and early 1990s was the collapse of the communist system first in Eastern Europe, and then the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Many of the countries, the former Soviet bloc countries, countries such as Czechoslovakia, that became the Czech Republic and the Slovak Republic, Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, all of those countries, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, all of those countries had either been part of the Soviet Union or part of the Comintern bloc, the Soviet trading bloc, and those countries became part of, all of those countries I mentioned would become part of the European Union, that they joined the European Union. But so other regional trade agreements so the EU stimulated growth in trade agreements that were either bilateral or regional. Very important, most important one was initially the free trade agreements of the US and Canada, which would then involve the creation of the North American Free Trade Agreement in the early 1990s. The North American Trade Agreement, which is called NAFTA, was between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. They added Mexico in the early 1990s. So you had NAFTA between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, the success of the European Union, to some degree the Russia, the old Russia bloc. Russia formed agreements within many of the countries that had been part of the Soviet Union, particularly Central Asian countries like Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan, probably the most important ones of that. So that is as well. Now, an important point here is that globalization also began to take place. And globalization, and one of the big events there was the collapse of, that spurred that, the growth of China, of course. China was growing, particularly by the early 1990s, China began growing rapidly. As it caught, firms began moving production, manufacturing production, and that was because China was a member of GATT. China had good, a favorable trade. It was a trading regime that was very favorable, that helped China emerge as a major country. So China was involved in trade with these countries. Western countries, including Japan, Europe, the US, and Japan, were moving production to China in the 1990s. And certainly in this country, the collapse of the bubble economy, the asset bubble in the early 1990s, spurred that. So that was certainly my memory in my early years in this country, was the collapse of the bubble. And one of the main things that did was a big shift of production offshore from Japan to China, but also Indonesia and other Asian countries, but particularly to China. One of the problems, the multilateral trade organizations, as I mentioned, you had the development in the mid-1990s of the World Trade Organization, the WTO, which emerged in I believe, 1995. And so the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and so when the World Trade Organization emerged, there was an effort to have big multilateral trade agreements. But the problem with big multilateral trade agreements is that the only way you can get countries in a multilateral situation is everybody has to agree. And so the more parties that you get to the agreement, the more difficult it is to get agreements. When you have more than 100 countries in an agreement, if one country doesn't agree, that's a member, there's no agreement. So negotiating these types of agreements became very difficult. Another factor was a growing desire, particularly in the United States, to include access to service industries, and including telecommunication and finance, as well as an increased access for investment capital. So investment banks wanted more access to global markets, telecommunications, finance in general. There was a desire for more flow of capital. And the problem was that this just could not be done through multilateral channels. Multilateral channels just were too cumbersome, and so this provided increased incentives for regional trade agreements. And as I say, the European Union was the initial template, but we began seeing more of this type of this type of organization. As we said, the GATT era was dominated by tariff reductions. Non-tariff, non-MFN-based agreements were often negotiated in GATT rounds, but they were frequently side agreements that involved a limited number of countries. So you had the GATT. The GATT, as I said, was a multilateral that say you had all the countries. I had the A, B, C, D. So that all the countries were agreeing, but then some of these countries are going outside of the general agreement, and then they were making side agreements. Say countries A and B are going out there. They're making within members, but they were also making agreements between each other. So you started seeing, but it was groups of countries, not. So you had the big group, but then you'd have a smaller group that would go outside of that, and there'd be a number of countries that would be party to those agreements, but smaller than the big group of GATT countries. And so you had countries that were called the Kennedy Round, 1964-67, what was called the Tokyo Round, 73 to 79. And so these code agreements range from 10 to 40 out of a total of 121 members. There were 128 members of GATT at the end of GATT in 1995. In 1995, you saw the end of GATT. There were 128 members, in fact, that were members. It was too big for countries to really make these kinds of to agree on everything within such a large group. So now countries began to go outside. You're starting to get, which is leading to these kinds of regional trade agreements. There was something called the Uruguay Round, which led to the creation of the World Trade Organization in 1995. Now the difference is the GATT and the WTO is that all members of the WTO are bound by the same set of rules. These code side agreements that noted here that were made during the GATT era were folded into the WTO, and those codes became universal. So that was the thing that the establishment of the WTO provided, was that these code agreements, these side agreements had been made by subset of the main groups, were then folded back into the WTO when the GATT was eliminated and it became the WTO. So all of these side agreements then became part of the whole agreement. So that was the accomplishment of the creation of the WTO, is that now you had all of those side agreements were now universal rules for trade. But again, the problem was that the expectation was that the WTO would provide an institutional framework. So it was thought, okay, now we have this multilateral organization, we folded all these rules in, people are happy with that situation, we now want to be able to use this multilateral organization in order to expand world trade and expand the agreements. The problem was that the only round of negotiations under the WTO was the Doha round, and that started in 2001, and it's the talks have never completed. It's they've narrowed the topics of discussion over time. You're talking now about 16 years. There's just not there's not much product topics have been narrowed. So as I say, the irony is that finally that we had the creation of a World Trade Organization, a multilateral organization, and as soon as that was established, the world couldn't do any more multilateral trade agreements, and essentially the WTO was just too big. So they established these rules, put these countries together, and then they said, okay, well now we're too big to work together, to expand the trade within the WTO. So this has stimulated, because of that, because basically the WTO is too big, that it stimulated the growth of free trade agreements. And so that's what we've seen in the past 20 years, is a real emergence of trade agreements. And so under the GATT, Article 24, the GATT and the WTO members were able to form treaty agreements. Countries are given permission to form free trade agreements. So since they have that freedom, and since it's difficult to make agreements within the big organization, not surprisingly, that's what we've seen. And so let me just point out what each of these are. These are from 1 to 4 are more loose unions. Free trade agreement is the loosest. It removes tariffs and quotas for members within the group, and that's all that is. Customs union is something that establishes common tariffs for countries. So for countries within the union, you have common tariffs for countries that are outside the union. And the European Economic Community, the EEC, the initial was a customs union. common market, and see the difference between, we talked about the EEC and the EU. The EEC, which became the EU, but the EU is a common market, and so that's restrictions in the movement of factor of productions within the region. So within the EU are eliminations or on the movement of factors. That means people can migrate, capital can flow freely, so the European Union, of course, is the best example of that. And what strengthened that, some people can argue that that was a negative, but that was the euro. So the creation of the euro was designed to facilitate within the EU for the countries that are both EU members and members in the Eurozone. It makes it more easy to move factors of production within that union. And then we have economic union. And members of economic union adopt common macroeconomic policies. Well, at that point you're getting close to a nation. So this is almost, the economic union is almost a nation. And in fact, of course, the Eurozone is an economic union which takes up most of the members, but not all, of the common market. And an important exception within the EU and an important country that was not a member of the Eurozone is, of course, the UK. And the UK is now leaving the EU. And certainly the desire of people within the European Union was to make basically, you could call it a United States of Europe. And the problem is that in the end, you're able to get some type of economic union through the Eurozone. We've seen a lot of problems with it. And the European countries are not about to become, if anything, we're seeing it's going in the opposite direction. And if you're following, you're even seeing countries like, of course, Spain is at some risk of breaking up the UK, as well as talk about that. So we're seeing, in fact, forces that are kind of leading the other way to a separation and not increasing integration. We've seen these kinds of pressures. Now I haven't talked much about Asia in terms of that, and that's because free trade agreements came much later to Asia. There really weren't significant free trade agreements in Asia before 2000. You had ASEAN. ASEAN's been around for a while, but it hasn't really. It has slowly. It's had a drop of some tariff barriers, but there's still a lot of restrictions in the ASEAN countries. But the problem, the thing that's caused this to change in Asia is that the Asian countries, of course led by Japan and China being the most important countries, looking out the rest of the world and seeing these free trade agreements that are developing, WTO is not going anywhere. So that wasn't going anywhere. The Asian countries are seeing that there's an increase in trading blocks in other regions of the world. Asia's realizing it doesn't want to get left out. Of course, the emergence of China and India are forcing other countries to follow suit. Certainly, a perceived need for integration with trading partners within Asia. And also, structural reforms have been in place. Efforts throughout the Asia region for investment liberalization, domestic competition, harmonization of standards, upgrading technology development, and you're seeing all of that certainly within countries in Asia. And certainly these are the most important countries that are driving this: China, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, and Thailand. Thailand certainly has emerged as a significant country as well, but of course there are other countries in the region. And we've, in terms of the trends, I want to talk now about the trends in free trade agreements that we've seen over time. One of them is that there's increasing economic diversity within these free trade agreement areas, and that is both in the European Union, brought in a number of countries that were much further behind, that had very different economic levels. And particularly Eastern European countries such as Romania, particularly Romania, Bulgaria, very different, much lower economic levels of economic development in many of these countries. And increasing debt. These agreements, these free trade agreements have become increasingly in debt. As I said, the EU began as a customs union, and a customs union that evolved, as I mentioned, it's a customs union that became a common market, and to some degree has become an economic union. So you've seen that's what we call increasing depth of that. A very interesting example of an FTA that of considerable depth in Asia is the Japan-Singapore free trade agreement, and I think that's had a very interesting impact, probably to the benefit of Singapore to quite an extent. If you're familiar, in fact, it's certainly had an impact on my work, because many of the people that were involved in the real estate business in the 2000s, many of them are now located in Singapore, because there's a liberalization of financial trade between the two countries, and so much of the financial industry in this country has moved to Singapore. So it's moved offshore. Many people that are managing, and actually, to a degree, they've moved outside of the reach of the Japanese financial authorities. So it may not necessarily be. It's been something that Japanese financial authorities have less control over, actually, and so it's an interesting development. That's certainly one of the things that's had an effect on. But it's also that agreement, trade liberalization, foreign investment. There's a lot of cooperation between Japan and Singapore. Also very interesting emergence is agreements with countries that are making free trade agreements that are not close together. And there's a free trade agreement between the U.S. and the United States and Jordan, Middle Eastern country Jordan. I don't quite understand that. I don't know what. Maybe I suppose that could have some advantage for Jordan. Can't imagine it would have much advantage for the United States. Chile and China and Canada. Singapore, New Zealand, and then you have cross FTA, cross FTAs, and cross FTAs in, for example, the EU and Mexico. So Mexico is not a member of the EU, but there's a free trade agreement between Mexico and the EU. There's now a free trade agreement between Mexico and Japan. you have that type of situation. And as we know, we've had the efforts to have the trade agreement, the trade agreement between the Pacific region countries. That interestingly has not included, that did not include China. Of course, the United States, that was an agreement. Basically, the countries that come to an agreement, the United States is now pulled out of that. The election of President Trump has, one of the first things that he did was pulling out of that Pacific Trade Agreement. So one of the things that an important thing to consider when we think about what we want to think of is what's an underlying factor that's driving these kinds of multilateral, these bilateral trade agreements, which have coincided with the expansion of free trade agreement. The expansion of free trade agreements, and it's because the production of goods has become much more complicated. It's become much more complex in the last 20 years, up until through the end of the 20th century. Trade was dominated, or production was dominated by the production of goods in one country and the sale of that good outside of the country of origin. So what you would have is one country would make a good, and then other countries would, and then they would trade that good with another country. So that was a very common way that the production took place. But at the end of the 20th century, and in the 21st century, we've seen a change of that. It's the dominant form of production is what some people call made everywhere, sold, made in many countries, and sold, and it could be made in many countries and sold in a country. And many goods sold internationally are now produced through what are called global value chains, or called GVCs. And in these chains, inputs may be produced in a number of different countries that each specialize in some aspect of production of the final good. So in this situation, you may very well get an increase in localization economies. So you may have an expansion of localization economies, which enable in global value chains to take place. And in such an environment, the concern of trade agreements then becomes the flow of cross-border inputs through a global value chain. And so the movement of the final product to final demand becomes of secondary consideration. The consideration is the flow, not of final goods, but of inputs. So that's a big change. Now, one of the things that we're seeing, though, I talked about it last semester, and I'll touch on this a little bit today, is the increase as a result of this free trade, a free trade between countries. We've seen an increase in income disparities in the advanced countries. That's something that was discussed. I discussed at some length. I devoted a lecture to this in the last semester, but I'll talk about it a little bit today. These free trade agreements have certainly reduced, they've had a reduction in overall global income disparity. And probably for the first time in human history, we're seeing the emergence of China, and the huge growth in income in China, and now the emergence of India. We're beginning to see the same thing happen in India, that we're seeing, in fact, a reduction, probably for the first time in history, in world history, in global in global income disparities. But at the same time, this has come at the expense of the middle class in developed countries. The middle class has, in the developed world, and we've seen this in Europe, the United States, and in Japan, we've seen this as well in Japan, that the middle class has stagnated over the last 20 years. So you've had this development. Now, so people are talking about comparative, as I say, this has changed the sense of comparative advantage. And as I say, it could also be comparative advantage, increasing returns to scale. It's become very complicated, very complex. But as I say, it's caused an increase in tensions. And the tension is because people are being left behind, particularly in the developed world. There's some people are gaining a lot in the developed world. Lots of people are not gaining much at all. Some people are losing out. It's causing political unrest. And so we've seen that with Brexit. Certainly as a result of that, the anger in Brexit, or in Britain as a result of that. We've seen it with the election of Donald Trump as President of the United States. However you feel about Mr. Trump being President of the United States, there's no question that the fact that people have been left behind is an important factor in his election. So we've talked about this. This regionalism. You've seen this kind of emergence of cross-flow of inputs. But we've seen it's basically, and so this framework, as I say, this framework of regionalism and trade agreements, the idea is that countries and regions that can facilitate the cross-border flow of inputs will be able to attract capital and technology. But the problem again is that the people that are being left behind are rebelling. The people that are being left behind in these countries are rebelling. I'll give, let's see. I want to talk about an approach in economic analysis of trade flows. And one of the things is that we've seen these emergence of these trading blocks, increase of free trade agreements, increase in trade, increase in the complexity of trade. But the problem, it's been very difficult in economists have been trying to measure the effect of trade, the benefits, the benefits of trade. The problem is that the effect of the agreement itself is being considered to be outside of the trade flow, and so the agreement was considered. You've had trade agreements, and they're considered to be exogenous to the observed change in trade flow. Well, there's been efforts to deal with this problem and to estimate the effect on trade between two countries as if the trade agreement had not taken place. And so what people are now looking at is you're looking at the flow of trade between countries before the agreement, and then to see and to develop techniques to consider, well, what would have happened had the agreement not taken place? What would have been the effect? What would have been the trade between the two countries had the agreement not taken place? Make an estimation of that. That's called, it's called a synthetic control. And then to say, okay, well, this is what we estimate would have happened had it not taken place, which is different from assuming that all of the change is the effect of trade. So now then we can look and see that the change from what would have happened if the agreement had not taken place to when if the agreement actually to the effect, and then we can see to make an estimation of the actual effect of trade flow. Now the reason and there's a paper, and I'll send this. I'll send this to you, because this is the importance here is that we want to measure. Economists want to measure what's the real effect of trade. What's the effect of and to separate out the effect of the trade, and the effect is that there's an increase. It's considered that the effect of these trade agreements from 104 country pairs in the 1983 to 1995 period was a 3.8 percentage point annual increase in trade, relative to no trade agreement, and that the effect of the agreement in NAFTA is an increase in trade of 4.3 percentage points. Now, one of the interesting things about this, when I read this paper, and I looked, this is interesting, but it also noticed that there was an effect for some trade agreements such as NAFTA prior to the full implementation of the agreement. So in other words, this approach also allows to see that in fact, even before the agreement takes place, but when an agreement has been signed but before it's officially implemented, that you can see changes in trade even before the agreement. So people are already reacting, they're moving production, they're shifting production, they're getting ready for the change. And this is important because of the effect of NAFTA. And as I say, we've talked about the effect of the increase in income disparities in the industrial world. And as I say, that's including this country. We've seen some increase in income disparities here. Particularly, we've seen it in the United States. To some degree in Britain, we've seen a lot of it in the United States. And to no small degree, as I say, the election of Donald Trump as President of the United States probably has a great deal to do, ultimately, with this chart. And I'll show you why, and why I've introduced this paper. The interesting thing is that when you look, the NAFTA, okay, this is what's called the Gini coefficient. Those of you who were in my class last semester, I introduced this idea. The Gini coefficient measures income disparity across income classes within a country. So if there's no income, zero means no income disparity, everyone has the same income, and 100 means that one person has everything. So 100 means one person has everything, 0 means everybody has the same. Basically, income measures below 30 are considered to be a Gini coefficient measure below 30 is considered to be relatively even distribution of income. Japan is about a 30, 31. It's been in the upper 20s now, maybe about 30, 31. You see in many European countries, it's in the upper 20s. In the old Soviet Union countries, the members in communist countries, they actually had as low as 18, 19. Now the reason that is that everybody pretty much had the same income, which unfortunately for them it was everybody was poor, but everybody had the same income. So that was that, but everybody, they had equality, but they were equally poor. So what we see in the United States always has had more income disparity than other advanced countries. The United States is, Americans, we Americans have considered ourselves to be a land of opportunity, and so we've accepted a certainly, and part of that is that some people get ahead, some people get behind, and oh well, that's life. And we have winners and losers, and we like to call people who don't make a lot of money losers, and so we've kind of been okay with that. Now, if you look though, throughout the U.S. has very good data that goes back, Gini coefficient estimations that go back quite a long ways. this is up. It's now, it usually comes out a few years late, but because you have to collect, it's extensive data that you have to collect. Now what's interesting, you see a general upward trend from the 1960s up to, well, what year is that? That's 1991. Now the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, went into effect in 1992. So look at this. Now, an interesting thing is that this is the election of Ronald Reagan as President of the United States, a conservative president in 1980. And there were tax cuts that were passed in the United States. You saw an increase from here, this is here to here. So you saw an increase, you'd kind of fairly flat, late 1960s, some increase, but fairly flat, then some uptick, 38 to 41, but the reduction in taxes for rich people became richer, income disparity grew, then you had the big jump. And when I looked at this, one of the things that's very interesting is that the trade agreement goes into place here, but you see the jump here. And the reason for the jump is, and getting back to this paper, what's interesting about this paper is that it's, this paper notes, and you can see with NAFTA, that the effect of NAFTA began being felt before the agreement was implemented. So that's why you have this jump. And this is a big jump. That now went up 4 points. So you had all of these years from here, 1967, to 1991, and it only went from 38 to 41. And in 1 year, it jumps to 40, almost 40, from 41 to over 45. 1 year, and you've seen this upward trend. Steady, slow, upward trend, increase. 2011, it's almost 48. This is very, that's big income, that's becoming fairly large income disparities. This kind of income disparity, this is pretty close to Mexico. Mexico is the low 50s. Latin America, many Latin American countries are in the 50s. And Latin American countries have historically had a lot of social unrest and big income disparity. So your countries like Brazil in the upper 50s, like 58, 57, 58. So and many South American countries, Latin American countries are in the 50s. NAFTA's had the effect for the United States. It's converging to Mexico. The income disparity is approaching the income disparity that you see in Mexico. This has now become a problem. This is the problem. And this is why these free trade agreements are in threat. And this is why the global, the free trade and free movement of capital is a threat. And it's a threat because this increase in income disparity. This is really a major issue. The income disparity is a major issue. And and I would argue, and many people do, the reason why Brexit took place, the Brexit vote, surprisingly, people were shocked early last year when people in the UK voted to leave the EU. People were shocked. They weren't ready for it. People were shocked when Donald Trump was elected President of the United States. They were shocked. But this is why. This increase in income disparity. So this is a threat. It's a threat to a global trade agreement because not everybody's benefiting. And when people get left behind, they feel bad and resentful, and now they're striking back. So this is certainly an issue. It's certainly an important issue. I'm going to send several of these papers. I think it'll be important for you to go through some of this. let's see, I've used all of these as sources for this lecture. I think the interesting ones are this one, this Richard Baldwin, Multilateralizing 21st Century Regionalism. This is a conventional view of trade. This is the conventional view. This here by Richard Baldwin. This paper is the paper that I talked, The Impact of Trade Agreements, New Approach, New Insights. I think these are both interesting papers. I'll send both of these to you. I recommend that you take a look at them. As I say, this is your conventional view by what you might call the global elite of the kind of multilateralism, of multilateral free trade agreements, and the organization of production. This is the conventional view. This is what's under threat, and in fact that's what we're seeing with the policies that the new president of the United States is implementing. Is implementing policies to encourage manufacturing in the United States with an effort to increase the income of the middle class. So that's the so this is a very interesting paper. I think it's important to read a paper like this. This tells you what the global elites, the beliefs and thoughts of the global elites. So this is an important. I think that's an important paper. And I'm not saying there's any. People are well-meaning. These people are well-meaning, and overall the world's benefiting. But there's enough people that aren't, and it's producing a threat. Now I'm going to move. This is going to be review. I'm going to go a little bit of review. The reason why I'm going over this is because several of you were not in my class last semester. I want you to at least understand something about, a little bit about, to understand trade and to understand interaction across countries. It's very important to understand it's very important to understand some points about the drivers of trade. Drivers of trade at the macroeconomic level. Drivers of trade. What are the drivers of trade at the macroeconomic level? And what we talked about in the class last semester, and I'll go over briefly today, is the idea that savings and investment, that the level of savings and the level of investment within countries is the driver of trade imbalances. Trade imbalances and savings and trade imbalances and capital flows are connected. And what we're going to show you is mathematically why this takes place. So these are very basic models of macroeconomics. And what I'm doing here is that I want you to go over. Let me just check the time here. Okay, we're not going to have. We'll go into this in detail at the beginning of the next class. So let me go over. What I'd like you to do is go over this section. Mathematical identity. We're going to look at what are called the GDP identity. It's the GDP identity. And identity is a mathematical relationship that and you see that 3, it's an equals. That means it's an identity. That means equal means that something is the same. Basically, that they are that they're related. But what this says is that they produce the same value regardless of what values are substituted. They define the same function. So the difference is that like some f of x equals some function, some function. Is one way, but an identity is that it's two-way. It works. If it happens here, it happens here. What happens here is it happens here, and then it maps here. So this happens, it produces this effect. But in an identity, if it happens here, it happens here. It happens in both directions. That's what a mathematical identity is. So we want to consider, we're going to look at gross domestic product components. As I say, this is review for those of you who were in class last semester. But you familiarize yourself with these. Go over these. I suspect you have not had, if you've had any kind of discussion, my understanding is some people have had a discussion, they've heard about models that assume there's no trade. This shows where trade comes from, what some of the important drivers of, or at least of trade deficits and surpluses. So please just familiarize yourself with that. And what we have are, I'll go over these. When you, in GDP, that is a gross domestic product. GDP, gross domestic product. It has components. The main components are personal income, private investment, government expenditure, exports, expenditures on exports, imports, net exports, savings, also savings, and we use Y for G, and Y is what we use for GDP. The reason we use Y is because we ran out of other. We use G for government, so we have Y for GDP. So we go over. This talks about what each of those are. That's getting a bit of detail. Net exports are exports minus imports. But again, look, that's an identity. Exports minus imports. As they say, that's an identity. That means that if exports change, then net exports change. If net exports change, then there's some change in this relationship. If this relationship changes, then there's a change in this side. So it happens on both sides. Both sides are driving each other. Savings are defined as GDP minus private consumption, government consumption. So savings, and again, it's an identity. It's output. It's output minus private consumption minus government consumption. So what's left over is savings. And this is what the government and the private sector consume, and what they don't consume is savings. Now, this savings may be greater than that's net savings. So it's GDP minus consumption and government consumption. We go through, break out these components. What I want you to do for the next class, just you've already gone over, you may just to review, but if you haven't seen this, go over this very carefully and understand what this is. I want you to go over it very carefully and understand what it is, because when you can understand this, this may look a little bit complicated, but it's really not complicated. It's actually quite simple. And when you get your mind around what this is very powerful. It's a very powerful way to understand the things that drive trade imbalances and capital flows. So this is going to be very, very important to understand that. So go over this, go review this, go look over this section, and when we come next week, I'll open up, go through this carefully so that you understand this. This is very, very important, and you will have an understanding, and I told the class last semester, when you begin to understand this, the world changes. You'll see why things happen. You'll understand, when you understand these relationships, you'll understand something that most people just do not understand about trade. So go over that, and and this will give an example what kind of patterns you see and the drivers of these patterns. So we'll begin with that, and then we'll begin to look into. I think I'm going to move up the discussion on the effect of technology. I think I'll move that discussion up and begin discussing that, begin to introduce that topic on the effect of technology and the relationship between technological changes and the Great Depression and the Great Recession, and to understand what those events are, why they took place, and where technology plays a role in that, and most importantly, where are we likely to move? Where's the direction of the global economy is likely to take place in the next 10 to 20 years? So that's what we'll begin to. We'll introduce that topic. Begin talking about that. I think we'll go into. Let me check my other material to confirm that. But we'll go into. I think that's something that's a very interesting topic to people in this class. So I'll definitely bring that up and start talking about that very shortly. And I say most likely next week. Thank you.